The money was in 3 canvas bags, and the bags were tied with the same kind of cord used to close feed sacks, and there was nothing remarkable about any of it, except the amount and the place it had been hidden, and the fact that when Ida Crane counted it the second time, she got the same number she had gotten the first time, which was $9,000 exactly. She sat back on her heels on the cold floor of the back room and looked at the boards she had pulled up and at the dirt beneath them and at the 3 bags sitting in a row on the rough plank floor beside the hole, and she did not move for a long time. The house around her was silent. Outside, the October wind moved through the pine forest that pressed in close on 3 sides of the property, and the sound it made in the upper branches was the sound it always made, a long, slow exhalation, the breath of something enormous and indifferent. The nearest town was 11 miles east on a road that turned to mud after rain, and it turned to mud 2 days ago and had not dried since. She put the boards back. She put the bags back under the boards in the exact position and orientation she had found them. She went to the front room and sat at the table and looked at the cold stove and did not light it. She had been in this house for 4 days. Her name was Ida Crane, and she was 34 years old, and she had come to the Alderman property to serve as winter caretaker for a wage of $12 a month, which was not a good wage, but was a wage, and a wage was what she needed. The arrangement had been made through a land agent in Bozeman, a Mr. Pell, who smelled of bay rum and had a habit of not looking directly at her when he spoke, which she had decided after the 3rd meeting was not personal, but simply his way with everyone. The property belonged to a man named Silas Alderman, who had gone east for the winter to attend to a family matter that Pell had described only as considerable in nature, which told her nothing, but which she had not pressed. The house was a substantial pine log structure at the edge of a cleared meadow in the foothills south of the Crazy Mountains. 2 main rooms, a back room that had served as a storage and workroom, a root cellar accessible from outside, and a sleeping loft above the main room, reached by a steep ladder. There was a well, a small stable for her horse and the 2 goats that needed to be kept through the cold months, and a woodshed that was well stocked, which she had noted with relief. She had brought her own provisions for 2 months, her own bedding, a rifle, and her tools, by which she meant the practical collection of implements she had carried for the past 6 years, since her husband Martin died of a blood infection in the spring of 1877 and left her the horse, a debt she had spent 3 years paying, and a working knowledge of how to do most things a person needed to do to survive in Montana Territory alone. She had not been looking for the money. She had been looking for the source of a draft that came through the back room floor when the wind was from the north, a cold seep that found its way up through the planks and into the room, and ultimately into the main room under the connecting door. She had found the draft at the north edge of the floor near the wall, had begun pulling boards to check the foundation, and had found the bags before she found the source of the draft. The draft, when she finally located it, was a gap between the stone foundation and the sill log where the chinking had come loose. She had repaired it with a mixture of clay and dry grass she found in the woodshed. The gap was perhaps 2 inches wide and 4 inches long and explained the draft entirely. She went to bed that night without eating and lay awake in the loft listening to the pines and thinking about $9,000 and what it was doing in a hole in the floor of a house she was being paid $12 a month to keep. She had known poverty long enough to know exactly what $9,000 was. It was a working ranch, horses, cattle, equipment, and the land to run them on with enough left over to survive the first bad year. It was 750 months of caretaker wages. It was, in the more immediate and practical sense, the difference between the life she was living and any other life she might be able to imagine. She was not a woman given to self-deception, and so she sat with the thought she was actually having rather than the more comfortable thought she might prefer to be having, which was, "This is not mine, and I will not touch it." The thought she was actually having was more complicated than that.
In the morning, she got up and fed the goats and broke the ice on the water trough and brought in wood and built the fire and made coffee and ate a breakfast of cornmeal mush and dried apple, And while she did all of these things, she kept arriving back at the same set of facts. The money was in a hole in a floor that belonged to a man she had never met. The man had placed it there or had it placed there for reasons she did not know. He had gone east. He had left no instructions about the floor or its contents in any of the paperwork she had received from Pell, which either meant he did not expect the money to be found or did not expect her to look where she had looked or had forgotten it, which was possible but seemed unlikely given the amount. She went to the back room and stood in the center of it and looked at the boards. She did not pull them up again that day. On the 6th day, the first snow came. It was a light snow, 2 inches by evening, the sky clearing overnight so that the 7th morning was brilliant and cold, the meadow and the pine forest transformed into the particular white silence of early winter in the Montana foothills. She brought in double wood that day, checked the stable roof for stress, and banked the fire before dark in the way that would keep coals until morning. She had still not touched the money. What she had done was think about it with the careful, systematic attention she applied to problems that did not have obvious solutions. She had considered who might know about it. She had considered why it was in canvas bags rather than a strong box. She had considered what $12 a month meant to a man who had $9,000 under his floor, and she had arrived at an answer that she did not entirely like. It meant he did not consider the $12 significant, which meant the $9,000 was also not, to him, the entirety of what he had. A man with more than $9,000 gone east for the winter. She banked the fire and went up to the loft and lay in the cold and listened to the pine forest and the wind. At some point in the deep of the night, she heard a sound.
She was not asleep. She had not been fully asleep since the 4th day, and so she heard it clearly and immediately and without the confusion of waking. It came from below the main room floor, a single knock. Not the settling of timber, not the pop of a cold joint, not the particular sound a structure makes in deep cold when its materials contract. A knock, the deliberate kind, made by something with intention. She lay completely still. It did not come again. She remained still for a very long time. Then she reached for the rifle where it lay beside the bedroll and held it and waited for dawn. In daylight, she went outside and found the root cellar door. She had known it was there. The door was set into the north side of the house's foundation, 2 heavy pine planks hinged at the top, enclosed with an iron hasp and a padlock, the key to which had been on the ring Pell had given her. She had checked it on the first day, found it locked, opened it with the key, looked into the root cellar, and seen nothing remarkable. A low earthen-floored space, some empty shelving, the smell of old vegetables and cold soil, the particular dark of a space that receives no light. She had locked it again and thought nothing more of it. She stood looking at it now in the thin winter light. The hasp was closed, the padlock was in place. She could see from where she stood that it had not been opened since she had last opened it, because the thin skim of new snow that had settled across the hasp and the upper edge of the door was unbroken. She had not been in the root cellar since the first day. She went back inside and stood in the main room and thought about the geometry of the house. The root cellar was beneath the north side of the house, beneath, as best she could calculate, the approximate area of the back room. The space beneath the main room floor was accessible, in theory, from the root cellar if the root cellar extended far enough south. She had not measured the root cellar. She had looked into it and seen empty shelving and felt the cold and locked it again. She got the key ring and went back outside and opened the padlock and lifted the heavy door and held the lantern into the space and looked. The root cellar was larger than she had understood. It extended south, farther south than she had looked the first time, and the shelving on the south wall was not shelving. It was a rough timber frame with boards across it, and it was built against the south wall of the root cellar, which was also, she now understood, the underside of the back room floor. On the earthen floor beneath the framing, in the farthest reach of the lantern light, a bedroll, a tin cup, an extinguished candle stub.
the clear impression of a body in the soil, the compressed depression of someone who had been lying in this space for some time. She stood at the top of the cellar steps and held the lantern and looked at these things and did not go down. She locked the root cellar and went inside and put the bar across the front door and stood in the back room looking at the floor. The space beneath these boards connected to the root cellar. The root cellar had been occupied, was, for all she knew, still occupied, by someone who had slept directly under the place where $9,000 was hidden and had, in the deep of the previous night, knocked once on the boards above their head. She sat down on the wooden stool in the corner of the back room and thought about this for a long time. The knock had not been threatening. This was the thing she kept returning to. There were a dozen ways a person in a root cellar could make themselves known, could force their way out through the boards, could create enough noise to be genuinely alarming, could wait for the moment she was most vulnerable and act on it. Instead, one knock in the middle of the night and then silence. The knock of someone who wanted to be heard, but not to frighten. The knock of someone who needed something. She thought about who sleeps in a root cellar in October in Montana. She thought about the money.
She got up and went to the back room floor and pulled the boards up and took out the 3 bags and set them on the table in the main room where she could see them. Then she went back to the barred front door and stood thinking. She unbarred the door. She put her coat on and picked up the rifle and went outside and walked to the root cellar and stood a foot from the door and said, in a voice that was not loud but was clear and carried, "I know you're in there. I'm going to open this door. I'm armed and I'm not afraid to use what I'm holding, but I'm not going to unless I have reason to. If you need help, say so." Silence. Then, from below the door, muffled by the heavy pine planks, a voice, a girl's voice, young, saying one word, "Please." Her name was Calla. She was 14 years old, and she had been in the root cellar for 5 days. She came up the steps slowly, blinking in the flat winter light, and Ida saw immediately that she was in poor condition, thin in the way that spoke of days without adequate food, her clothing insufficient for the temperature, her hands red and chapped. She had a wool blanket from somewhere that she had wrapped around her shoulders over a dress that was summer weight and entirely wrong for October in the foothills. She was not injured, but she was cold and hungry, and she looked at Ida with the particular expression of someone who has been afraid for long enough that fear has become the operating condition, and they are no longer entirely sure what the absence of it would feel like. Ida brought her inside. She fed her, heated beans, cornbread, the last of the dried apple, and put more wood on the fire, and wrapped her in the heavier blanket from the loft, and sat across the table from her and waited while she ate. When the girl had eaten, she told Ida what she knew, which was not all of it, but was enough.
"Her father was named Calla," said Remy Walsh. "He was not a good man." She said this without drama or qualification, the way a person states of fact they have had a long time to accept. He had come to the Alderman property 6 weeks ago with 2 other men, and they had done something to the house. She did not know exactly what, she had not been inside, and then they had gone. She had been left with the horses 3 miles from the property and told to wait, and she had waited, and the 2 other men had come back, but her father had not come back with them, and the 2 men had looked at her with the particular look she had learned to recognize as the look that preceded a decision she did not want made about her, and she had run. She had run for 2 days through the foothills, and had found the property, and had found the root cellar open, and had gone in and hidden, and pulled the door closed from inside, which she demonstrated was possible, though it required getting the angle of the rope that held the interior handle exactly right. She did not know what her father and the 2 men had done at the house. She did not know where her father was. She did not ask about what Ida might have found in the house, and Ida noticed this. "The 2 men," Ida said. "Will they come back here?" Calla looked at the table. "They were looking for something," she said. "If they didn't find it, yes." Ida moved the 3 bags from the table to the loft. She did this while Calla slept. The girl had collapsed into sleep almost immediately after eating. the sudden crash of someone who has held themselves upright through necessity and has now been given permission to stop. She slept on the blankets by the fire, and Ida climbed to the loft with the bags and sat up there in the cold dark and turned the situation over in her mind the way she turned difficult problems, slowly, from every angle, looking for the shape of it.
The money had been placed here by someone. The most obvious candidate was Silas Alderman, in whose house it was, and whose house Remy Walsh and two unnamed men had visited 6 weeks ago for purposes unknown. Whether Walsh had found the money was unclear. The bags had appeared undisturbed, the boards above them had appeared undisturbed, but a careful man could replace boards carefully. Whether he had found it and left it was a different question with a different set of possible answers. The girl in the root cellar for 5 days. The two men who would come back if they hadn't found what they were looking for. Ida sat in the loft with the rifle across her knees and worked through the arithmetic of her position. She could take the money and the horse and ride east on the mud road toward Bozeman and be gone before anyone arrived. 11 miles of mud road, the snow making it worse, but passable on horseback if she went carefully. She could take the $9,000 and ride out of Montana territory and never return, and no one who mattered to her would know. She had no family. She had obligations to a land agent who smelled of bay rum. She was a caretaker for a man she had never met. She could leave the girl. Callow was not her responsibility. The girl had survived 5 days in a root cellar. She could survive the ride to town if Ida left her the horse. She could leave instructions, provisions, directions. Ida sat in the loft and looked at the dark ceiling of the house and listened to the pine forest and thought about Martin dying in the spring of 1877 and about the 3 years of debt after that and about $12 a month and about $9,000 in canvas bags beside her left knee. Then she thought about a 14-year-old girl in a summer dress in a root cellar in October and about the look that preceded a decision being made about someone. She came down from the loft without the bags. She woke Calla before dawn. She explained, briefly and without softening it, what she understood about the situation. She explained that 2 men might come to this property and that she did not intend to be unprepared when they did. She explained that Calla needed to tell her everything she could about the 2 men, their names if she knew them, their appearance, how they were armed, whether they had been to this property before. Calla told her. One of the men was named Greer, she thought. She had heard her father say the name. He was large, she said, and quiet in the way that large men are sometimes quiet, the quiet of someone who does not need to make noise to communicate what they are. The other she did not know. Both had rifles and handguns. She did not know if they had been to the property before. Ida made coffee and thought about the layout of the property. The cleared meadow in front of the house. Anyone approaching from the east would be visible crossing the meadow for at least 300 yards. The pine forest pressed close on the south and north sides, which meant approach from those directions was possible without significant visibility. The stable was to the north, the woodshed was to the south. She had 1 rifle, adequate ammunition, and 11 miles of mud between her and any kind of help. She moved Calla to the loft. She explained that whatever happened, the girl was to stay in the loft and be quiet and only come down if Ida called her specifically by name. She gave Calla the skinning knife from her pack because it was the right thing to give someone in a loft, and because the look on the girl's face when she received it was the look of someone who had been given something real rather than something symbolic. She spent the morning preparing the house the way she knew how to prepare it, which was not the way a soldier or a lawman would have prepared it, but the way a woman who had lived alone in difficult country for 6 years prepared it, which meant methodically and without sentimentality. She moved the furniture so that the sightlines from the windows were clear. She identified the positions in the room from which she could see each window and door while remaining away from them. She stacked additional wood inside so that she would not need to go out for it. She considered and rejected a series of options that involved trying to reach the stable and her horse, because the stable was to the north and the pine forest was to the north, and she did not want to be in the open ground between the house and the trees when unknown men arrived.
She ate lunch and set the rifle against the wall within reach and sat at the table and waited. They came in the afternoon, from the south through the woodshed side, which told her they had been here before and knew the approach. She saw them through the south window, two shapes moving through the pines at the tree line, coming carefully, not rushing. She watched them come for a full minute before she moved. They were perhaps 50 yards from the tree line to the house. They would reach the house in less time than she wanted. She made a decision. She went to the front door and opened it and stepped onto the front step with the rifle and looked south at the two men who had just come out of the pines and stopped. They stopped because she had put herself where they could see her and where she could see them, and where the relative positions of all three people in the clearing were clear to everyone. She did not raise the rifle. She held it in both hands, muzzle toward the ground. One of the men was large, with the particular stillness of the man Calla had described. The other was smaller and stood slightly behind and to the left, which told her something about the arrangement between them. Both had rifles. Neither raised them.
The large man looked at her for a long moment across the clearing. "We've got business with this property," he said. His voice carried easily in the cold air, low and even. "I'm the caretaker," she said. "The owner is away. You can come back in the spring." "We'll come in now," he said. "It won't take long." She held the rifle in both hands and looked at the large man and thought about $9,000 in the loft above her and a 14-year-old girl with a skinning knife. "I know what you're looking for," she said. The clearing went very still. "Do you?" the large man said. "I found it 4 days ago," she said. "It's not here anymore." This was a lie and not a lie simultaneously, which was the only kind of statement that could serve her in this moment. The money was in the house. The money was not where it had been. Both of these things were true. The large man looked at her. He was reading her the way experienced men read people, looking for the thing beneath the thing being said. She looked back at him with the expression she had learned to maintain in difficult negotiations, which was the expression of someone who has already accepted whatever happens next and is therefore not afraid of it, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to hold in her face. "Where?" he said. "That's a different conversation," she said. "One I'd be willing to have if the two of you come back in the daylight tomorrow, alone, without the rifles." "That's not how this works," he said. "I know it's not how you planned it to work," she said. "It's how it's going to work, or it's not going to work at all. The money's not on this property. If you take this house apart tonight, you won't find it, and you'll have done the work for nothing, and I'll have no reason to help you find it." Silence. The pine forest around the clearing was absolutely still. The cold was deepening as the afternoon went toward evening, the light flattening and going gray. The smaller man said something to the large man that she could not hear. The large man did not respond to it visibly. He looked at Ida for a long time. "Tomorrow," he said finally, "at dawn." He turned and went back into the pines. The smaller man followed. She stood on the step and watched the tree line until she was certain they were gone, and then she went back inside and barred the door and sat on the floor of the main room and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. She went up to the loft. Calla was where she had left her, pressed into the far corner with the blanket and the knife, her face pale and her eyes very wide. She had been still and quiet through all of it, which Ida noted. "Are they gone?" Calla said. "For tonight," Ida said. "What did you tell them?" Ida sat on the edge of the loft and looked at the girl. "I told them I moved the money. I bought us until morning." "What are we actually going to do?" This was the right question, and Ida had been working on the answer since she stepped back inside. She had told the two men the money was not on the property, which meant if they arrived in the morning and searched the house and found it in the loft, the conversation would be over in the worst possible way, which meant the money needed to not be in the house by morning. "I'm going to ride to town tonight," she said. "The road's bad, but it's passable. I'll be there before dawn.
I'll bring the sheriff back." Calla looked at her. "You're leaving me here?" "I'm leaving you in the loft with the bar on the front door and the rifle," Ida said. "They won't come back tonight. They said dawn." "You're taking the money with you?" Ida looked at the canvas bags. "Yes." "As evidence," Calla said. "As evidence," Ida said. The girl looked at her for a moment. 14 years old, in a loft in the Montana foothills, with a knife she held like she knew the weight of it.
"My father," Calla said. "Do you think he's dead?" Ida thought about the visit 6 weeks ago, about Remy Walsh not coming back with the other 2 men, about the kind of men who leave someone behind. "I think the sheriff is going to want to look for him," she said carefully. "That's the honest answer." Calla nodded once, slowly. Ida took the 3 bags down from the loft and put them in the canvas pack and saddled the horse in the dark of the stable, working by lantern, moving as quietly as she could. She went back inside and gave Calla the rifle and showed her again how the bar on the door worked, and told her that if anyone came before she returned, she was to stay in the loft and not respond to anything said from below. "Why are you doing this?" Calla said. She was not asking about the logistics. She was asking the other thing. Ida thought about how to answer that. "Because you said please," she said finally, "and because you've been in that root cellar for 5 days and you're 14 years old, and those are sufficient reasons." She rode out in the dark on the mud road toward Bozeman with $9,000 in the pack behind her saddle, in the cold pine forest on both sides, and the mountains had visible, but present in the dark to the north. The sheriff arrived at the Alderman property the following morning with 2 deputies. The 2 men, Greer and the smaller one, whose name turned out to be Fetch, were found still in the pine forest to the south, camped 70 yards from the tree line, apparently unwilling to go further in the night. They had waited, just as Greer had said they would, and the waiting had cost them. Calla came down from the loft when Ida called her name. The $9,000 was turned over to the sheriff and subsequently to a territorial court in Bozeman, which took 6 weeks to determine that the money had been withdrawn from a bank in Helena by Silas Alderman approximately 1 year prior, and that its provenance was legal, that Alderman had placed it in his house for reasons that were his own, and that he would explain in person when he returned from the East, which he did the following March, and which explanation turned out to be entirely ordinary, a distrust of banks following a specific series of failures that had affected men he knew, and a belief that money under his own floor was more reliably his than money under someone else's. Remy Walsh was found the following spring in the root cellar of an abandoned homestead 12 miles north. He had been there since early October. The manner of his death was not shared publicly, but it was consistent with the presence of 2 men who were comfortable with outcomes that required no witnesses. Greer and Fetch were tried in the spring. The charge was conspiracy to commit robbery, and a second charge arising from Walsh, which carried a longer consequence. Ida gave testimony, Calla gave testimony, and then was taken in by a family in Bozeman, which was what happened to children in 1883 when the alternative was worse, and Ida understood it to be a better outcome than most. Ida received a letter from Silas Alderman in April. He expressed gratitude for her care of the property and her integrity regarding his private holdings, and he offered to extend her caretaking arrangement at a revised wage of $15 per month if she was willing to return for the following winter. He did not mention the specific figure of $9,000. He did not need to. She wrote back and said she would consider it. She had ridden the mud road to Bozeman in the dark in October, with $9,000 behind her saddle, and she had turned it over to a sheriff she had woken at 4 in the morning. And she had done this because a girl in a root cellar had said please, and because 14 years old in a summer dress in Montana in October was a fact that did not allow for a different response. And she had understood this while she sat in the loft with the bags and worked through the arithmetic of the situation. The arithmetic had not changed. The money was not hers. The girl's situation was not her problem in the technical sense that nothing required her to treat it as such.
She was a caretaker on a $12 a month arrangement with no obligations that extended to the people who slept in the root cellar. None of this had changed. She had simply found, in the working through of it, that the arithmetic was not the only thing that mattered, that there was a different calculation, not of money or safety or self-interest, but of the kind of person who emerged from a given choice, and that this calculation also had a result, and that the result was something she had to live inside of afterward, and that living inside the result of having ridden east with $9,000 and left a 14-year-old girl with a knife was not something she was willing to do. She did not consider this particularly noble. She considered it practical in a way that the other arithmetic was not. In the spring, she went back to the Alderman property for the second winter at $15 a month, and the pine forest was green, and the root cellar was empty, and the meadow was full of the particular yellow-green of new grass in the Montana foothills, and she repaired the board in the back room floor that she had pulled up in October and replaced it, and did not pull it up again. What a person does when the arithmetic is clear, and they do it anyway, when they ride 11 miles of mud road in the dark because the alternative is a version of themselves they cannot sustain, that is not a heroic thing. It is not even an unusual thing when you look at it from the right angle. It is simply the minimum required to remain the person you have decided to be. In this country, in that time, that minimum was sometimes very high. She met it when she had to, and she did not congratulate herself for it, and she did not regret it. That is the most that can be said, and it is enough.